I'm a 30-year-old woman, and I've been dating my partner Ethan 32M for 2 years now. Ethan is everything I could ever ask for in a partner: kind, hardworking, and endlessly patient. Unfortunately, none of that seems to matter to my parents. They've decided they don't approve of him, and honestly, I'm at my wit's end. To give some background, my parents have always been traditional. Growing up, I watched them pass judgment on anyone who didn't fit their very specific mold of what was acceptable. When my sister got married a few years ago, my parents outright refused to attend the wedding because they didn't like her husband. It wasn't because he was a bad person, but because he wasn't from the right background. Basically, he didn't meet their checklist of criteria. That decision caused a huge rift in our family, and it's never fully healed. When Ethan and I started dating, I knew there was a chance my parents wouldn't approve. Ethan doesn't come from a wealthy family like mine, and he practices a different religion. He's built a successful career on his own, and he treats me better than anyone ever has, but none of that matters to them. To them, he's just not good enough. At first, I tried to ease them into the idea of meeting him. I'd bring him up in conversations, share stories about how thoughtful he is, and drop hints about how serious we were getting. For over a year, I tried everything, inviting them to casual coffee meetups, proposing dinners, even suggesting video calls. Every single time, they shut it down. It was either we're too busy or we don't think this is the right time. Ethan, bless him, has been nothing but patient throughout all of this. He told me he understood their hesitance and that he was willing to wait for them to come around. But as the months passed, I could see it was starting to wear on him. He'd never say it outright, but I knew it hurt him that my parents wouldn't even give him a chance. The tipping point came when I planned a family dinner, hoping to finally bridge the gap. I let my parents know well in advance, and while they weren't exactly enthusiastic, they didn't outright refuse. I thought that was progress. Ethan and I even picked out a nice restaurant that we knew they'd like. But then, just hours before we were supposed to meet, my mom called me to say they wouldn't be coming. No explanation, just a flat-out refusal. I was furious. After I hung up, I checked my email and saw a message from my dad. It was this long, passive-aggressive diatribe about how they would never approve of Ethan and how they were only looking out for my best interests. They made it sound like I was some naive child being led astray, which couldn't be further from the truth. I vented to my friends later that night, and they were just as frustrated as I was. One of them even joked that Ethan sounded like the dream boyfriend their parents wished they had. They encouraged me to take a stand and stop letting my parents dictate my life. Ethan, on the other hand, suggested that maybe it was time to step back and let my parents come to us when they were ready. He didn't want me to strain my relationship with them on his account. But here's the thing, I'm tired of waiting. It's been over a year, and they've made zero effort. I know my parents well enough to understand that if I don't push back, nothing will change, so I came up with a plan. My parents have a close-knit social circle, and their friends have always been more open-minded than they are. I grew up around these people, and I know they've always treated me with kindness and respect. If my parents won't give Ethan a chance, maybe their friends will. I decided to host a casual dinner party and invite some of my parents' closest friends. The idea was to let them see who Ethan really is. No filters, no preconceived notions. Ethan was on board with the plan, even though he admitted he was nervous. He said he wanted to make a good impression, not just for me but also because he hoped it might soften my parents' stance. I knew it was a gamble, but at this point I didn't see any other way to move forward. I sent out the invitations, careful not to make it sound too formal. Just a casual dinner with good food and company. The responses started rolling in, and to my relief, most of the guests said yes. My parents, however, were another story. When they found out about the party, they accused me of being manipulative. My mom called to say they wouldn't be attending because they didn't want to be part of my games. I didn't bother arguing. If they wanted to stick their heads in the sand, that was their choice. As the date of the dinner approached, Ethan and I threw ourselves into planning. He took charge of the menu, insisting on cooking everything himself. Watching him in the kitchen, so focused and determined, reminded me why I'm fighting so hard for us. He deserves a fair chance, and I'm going to make sure he gets it, even if my parents refuse to see it. Update 1. The night of the dinner party finally arrived. Ethan had spent the entire day in the kitchen, meticulously preparing the menu. He insisted on doing most of the cooking himself, and I let him, knowing it was his way of pouring love into the evening. By the time guests were due to arrive, the house smelled amazing: rosemary chicken, roasted vegetables, and a decadent chocolate dessert that Ethan had perfected over the years. The guest list was a mix of my parents' oldest friends, people who had been around since I was a kid. Some of them were like surrogate aunts and uncles to me, so I was hopeful they'd give Ethan a fair shot. When I sent out the invitations, I kept it simple, just a casual dinner to catch up. Everyone seemed excited, except my parents, of course. They had flat out refused to come, accusing me of trying to manipulate them into accepting Ethan. I didn't bother arguing. It was their loss. Guests started trickling in just after 7 p.m. Ethan greeted each person with a warm handshake and a genuine smile, immediately putting everyone at ease. By the time all the seats around the dining table were filled, the room was buzzing with conversation. Ethan moved effortlessly between pouring drinks, checking on the food, and engaging with the guests. Midway through the meal, the guests started to take notice of Ethan's charm. One of my mom's friends complimented his cooking, and another remarked on how thoughtful he was. I overheard someone mention that they'd heard some things about Ethan from my parents, but they quickly added that they were starting to wonder if those stories were exaggerated. As the night went on, the conversation naturally shifted. One of the guests, a close friend of my parents, hesitated before speaking. They admitted that my parents had been vocal about their disapproval of Ethan, but they couldn't understand why. "He seems wonderful," they said. I took a deep breath and explained. I told them about the countless times I tried to arrange a meeting, only for my parents to refuse. I described how patient Ethan had been, how he'd gone out of his way to respect their boundaries, even when it hurt. I didn't badmouth my parents, I just laid out the facts. The mood in the room shifted. People began to murmur in agreement, questioning why my parents were being so stubborn. One guest, who had always been particularly close to my mom, promised to talk to her and see if they could help mediate. Another said they'd reach out to my dad. By the time dessert was served, it felt like Ethan had won over the entire room. The evening wrapped up around 10 p.m., with guests lingering to thank us for a lovely night. As they left, several of them made a point to compliment Ethan, saying things like, "Your parents are really missing out and I'll have to tell them how great this was." The next morning, I woke up to a notification on my phone. One of the guests had posted a photo from the dinner party on social media, tagging Ethan and me. The caption read, "Wonderful evening with amazing people." So impressed by Ethan, what a gem. I smiled at first, but then it hit me, this post was public. My parents would definitely see it. Sure enough, by noon, my phone was ringing. My mom's name flashed on the screen, and I braced myself before answering. She didn't even say hello. She launched straight into a tirade about how I'd humiliated them by going behind their backs. She accused me of turning their friends against them and making them look bad. I didn't raise my voice or argue. I simply told her the truth. Ethan deserved the same chance anyone else would get. I reminded her that they'd had every opportunity to meet him but chose not to. If their friends saw through the negativity, maybe it was time for them to reconsider their stance. My mom was furious. She ended the call by saying they wouldn't be speaking to me again, at least not for a while. I set the phone down, feeling a mix of emotions. That afternoon, I got a message from one of the guests, the same family friend who had promised to mediate. They said they'd already spoken to my parents and felt confident that this was the beginning of a change, even if it would take time. I wasn't sure if I believed them, but it was nice to hear someone was on my side. As for Ethan, he was supportive as always. When I told him about my parents' reaction, he shrugged and said, "At least the people who matter are starting to see the truth." By the end of the day, I couldn't help but feel a little hopeful. Maybe this dinner party had planted the seeds for something better, or maybe it had just made my parents dig their heels in deeper. Either way, I knew one thing for sure: Ethan and I weren't backing down. Update 2. After the dinner party, it didn't take long for the ripple effects to start. Within days, my extended family caught wind of what had happened. Some of them had seen the social media post from the family friend, while others heard directly from my parents. Calls started coming in from aunts, uncles, and cousins, all wanting to know what was going on. The reactions were split. Some of my relatives were supportive, saying they didn't understand why my parents were making such a big deal about Ethan. Others sided with my parents, parroting their complaints about how I was being disrespectful and stubborn. It felt like the whole family was taking sides, and the tension only grew from there. Ethan, being the kind-hearted person he is, felt terrible about the whole situation. He told me he didn't want to be the cause of any family drama and even suggested that maybe we should back off for a while. But I told him it wasn't about him, it was about my parents refusing to let go of their outdated standards. Ethan quietly supported my decision, even though I could tell it weighed on him. Then things escalated. A close family friend called me one evening to let me know that my parents were spreading some nasty rumors about Ethan. They were saying he was manipulative, controlling, and only with me for financial reasons. I couldn't believe it. Ethan had always been the most selfless person I knew, and hearing these lies made my blood boil. I reached out to the friends who had attended the dinner party, hoping they could help clear things up. When I told them what my parents were saying, they were shocked. One of them said, "That's not the Ethan we met. He was kind, polite, and clearly head over heels for you." Another added that they'd always respected my parents, but this behavior was making them question everything. Word started spreading within my parents' social circle. More and more of their friends began reaching out to me, either to check in or to share their disappointment in how my parents were handling the situation. It was clear their credibility was taking a hit, and they didn't like it one bit. In the middle of all this, my sibling reached out. They've always been the peacemaker in our family, and I was surprised to hear them say they were fully on my side. They told me they'd met Ethan a few times and thought he was great. Then they dropped a bombshell. My parents were planning to host a gathering to set the record straight. It was basically a meeting to air their grievances about Ethan and explain their stance to the extended family. I decided I wasn't going to let them spin their narrative unchallenged. If they were going to talk about Ethan, I'd be there to defend him. I told my sibling I'd attend the gathering, and they promised to back me up. The day of the event arrived, and I walked in prepared for the worst. My parents had invited a mix of family members and close friends, and it was clear they were hoping to rally support. After some small talk and refreshments, my dad stood up and began speaking. He started with vague comments about family values and making the right choices, but it didn't take long for him to start attacking Ethan directly. He accused him of being a bad influence, of manipulating me into turning against them, and of not being a good match for our family. I let him finish, then stood up. I didn't yell or get emotional, I just stated the facts. I talked about how Ethan had always treated me with love and respect, how he'd been nothing but patient with my parents despite their rejection, and how their refusal to meet him was based on shallow judgments, not reality. I also pointed out that many of the people in the room had met Ethan themselves and could vouch for his character. The room fell silent. Then, one of my parents' oldest friends spoke up. They said they'd been at the dinner party and thought Ethan was wonderful. Another person chimed in, saying they couldn't understand why my parents were so adamant in their disapproval. Before long, it felt like the entire room was turning against them. My mom tried to regain control of the situation, accusing me of being ungrateful and disrespectful. But the more they doubled down, the more isolated they seemed. Eventually, my parents stormed out, clearly embarrassed and furious. After they left, several people came up to me to show their support. One family friend said, "I've known your parents for decades, but I've never seen them act like this. Ethan seems like a great guy, and they're only hurting themselves by refusing to see it." Ethan wasn't at the event, but when I got home and told him what happened, he just hugged me and said, I'm proud of you for standing your ground. In the weeks that followed, the fallout continued. My parents stopped speaking to me entirely, but their friends started inviting Ethan and me to more gatherings. It felt like a shift was happening. While my parents remained distant, the rest of the family and their social circle were starting to embrace Ethan. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we might actually be moving in the right direction, even if my parents weren't ready to join us yet. Update 3. A few weeks after the family gathering debacle, I got word from one of my parents' closest friends, a woman I've known since childhood. She had been at our dinner party and was one of the many who'd spoken highly of Ethan. Apparently, she decided to take matters into her own hands and paid my parents a visit. From what I heard later, she didn't hold back. She brought up how gracious Ethan had been at the dinner party, and how unfair it was that my parents were refusing to even meet him. She pointed out that most of their friends were starting to question their stance, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to justify their behavior. My parents were reportedly defensive, but the conversation seemed to plant a seed. Soon after, I received an email from my mom. It wasn't an apology, but it was a clear attempt to extend an olive branch. She wanted to talk things over and suggested we meet for coffee. I was skeptical but agreed, hoping this might be the start of some progress. When we met, it didn't take long for the conversation to turn to Ethan. My mom repeated the same arguments I'd heard before, insisting he wasn't the right fit for our family. She leaned on vague reasons like his background and upbringing, completely ignoring his accomplishments and the kind of person he is. I couldn't stay silent. I reminded her of other family members whose partners didn't fit her so-called standards but were still welcomed with open arms. I listed examples, pointing out the glaring hypocrisy. Instead of addressing my points, she accused me of being ungrateful for everything they'd done for me. The conversation quickly became circular, and I realized we weren't going to get anywhere. I ended the meeting early, telling her I wasn't going to change my stance. Meanwhile, life outside of family drama was going well. Ethan received a big promotion at work, solidifying his already stable career. He was thrilled, and so was I. It felt like yet another reminder of how unfair my parents' judgment was. They refused to see all the ways Ethan was proving himself. Around the same time, my sibling decided to throw a party. They invited the whole family, including my parents and Ethan. When I heard my parents would be attending, I knew this could be another tense encounter, but I decided to go regardless. Ethan, ever the optimist, agreed to come along. The party started off well enough. Ethan and I arrived early to help my sibling set up, and soon the house was filled with family and friends. My parents arrived late, and while they greeted everyone else, they completely ignored Ethan and me. It was awkward, but we carried on as if nothing was wrong. Throughout the evening, it became clear that their behavior wasn't going unnoticed. Guests would glance at my parents and then at Ethan, clearly picking up on the tension. One cousin even pulled me aside to ask why they were acting so cold. I just shrugged and said, "That's a question for them, not me." At one point, Ethan was chatting with a group of guests when my parents walked by. They didn't even acknowledge his presence, which prompted one of the guests to ask me later, "What's their deal?" "Ethan's great." I told them it was a long story but that I appreciated their support. As the night went on, it became harder for my parents to maintain their facade. Other guests began commenting on how welcoming and warm Ethan was, contrasting it with my parents' frosty demeanor. It was clear they were feeling uncomfortable. They eventually left early, avoiding any direct confrontation. After they left, my sibling pulled me aside to commend me for standing my ground. They said it was clear to everyone at the party who the real problem was, and they were proud of how I handled myself. It felt good to have their support, especially after everything that had happened. In the weeks following the party, the dynamic within the family started to shift even more. Ethan and I were invited to more gatherings by extended family and family friends, many of whom made it clear they didn't share my parents' views. It was as if the rest of the family had decided to make up for my parents' absence by going out of their way to include us. As for my parents, they remained distant. I didn't hear from them directly, but I knew from my sibling that they were feeling increasingly isolated. Their friends were calling them out on their stubbornness, and their refusal to budge was starting to backfire. It wasn't the resolution I'd hoped for, but it felt like a turning point. The people who mattered were standing by Ethan and me, and my parents were beginning to face the consequences of their choices. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we were moving forward, even if my parents weren't ready to join us yet. Update 4. After the party my sibling hosted, it didn't take long for word to spread about my parents' behavior. People who had attended the event started talking, sharing how obvious it was that my parents were going out of their way to ignore Ethan. Soon enough, even those who weren't there were hearing about it. The consensus was clear: my parents' actions were unfair, and they were doing more harm to themselves than anyone else. It wasn't just family who noticed the shift. My parents' friends, who had always been part of their tightly knit social circle, started pulling away. A few friends stopped responding to their invitations, while others declined to attend gatherings they hosted. It wasn't an outright boycott, but it was clear that people were distancing themselves. The friends who had been at our dinner party seemed especially disillusioned. One of them even told my sibling that they didn't want to enable my parents' behavior anymore. My parents, predictably, blamed me. They showed up at my door one afternoon, unannounced, demanding to know why I was turning everyone against them. I didn't react the way they expected. Instead of arguing, I calmly explained that their actions were the problem, not mine. I pointed out that people were drawing their own conclusions based on what they saw and heard, and I had no control over that. They didn't take it well. My dad accused me of being disrespectful, and my mom demanded an apology for the embarrassment I had caused. I refused, standing my ground. I told them that I wasn't going to apologize for standing by Ethan or for living my life the way I saw fit. The conversation ended with them storming out, vowing not to speak to me again unless I came to my senses. Ethan, ever supportive, suggested we take a short trip to get away from the drama. We booked a cabin in the mountains for a long weekend, and it was exactly what I needed. While we were there, I got a call from my sibling. They told me that my parents had missed out on a significant opportunity within their social circle. A prominent family friend had hosted an event, a networking opportunity my parents would never have skipped in the past, but they weren't invited. According to my sibling, this was a direct result of how their behavior was being perceived by the community. When we got back from the trip, I received a call from a family elder. They wanted to mediate, hoping to smooth things over between me and my parents. I was open to hearing them out, but when they brought up the idea of reconciliation, I made one thing clear: I wasn't backing down on Ethan. The elder promised to speak with my parents, but I knew it wouldn't be easy. A week later, I sent a final email to my parents. I outlined my boundaries and what I expected if they wanted to move forward. I was firm but respectful, letting them know that I wasn't going to tolerate the way they'd treated Ethan, or me, any longer. I explained that I valued our relationship, but it couldn't continue the way it was. I also made it clear that Ethan wasn't going anywhere, and if they wanted to be part of my life, they needed to make an effort. They never responded. For a while it stung, but I knew I'd done everything I could. Instead of dwelling on their silence, I focused on the people who were showing up for me and Ethan. Friends and extended family continued to invite us to events, and we found ourselves more included than ever. It felt like we were building our own community, one that was supportive and welcoming. Meanwhile, my parents tried to rebuild their social circle. They hosted a few gatherings, but attendance was noticeably sparse. The people who did show up were polite but distant, and it was clear that my parents were struggling to regain the standing they once had. My sibling encouraged them to apologize and make amends, but they remained as stubborn as ever. Over time, I began to see their behavior in a different light. It wasn't just about Ethan, it was about their own insecurities and need for control. They couldn't handle the idea of not being the ultimate authority in their children's lives, and instead of adapting, they doubled down on their rigidity. It was sad, but I knew it wasn't something I could fix. The family dynamic had shifted permanently, but I felt at peace. Ethan and I were thriving, surrounded by people who cared about us. I no longer felt the need to chase my parents' approval, and for the first time, I could focus entirely on the life we were building together. Update 5. A year has passed since everything with my parents came to a head, and looking back, it's hard to believe how much has changed. Ethan and I have grown even closer during this time, solidifying our relationship in ways I didn't think were possible. He's not just my partner, he's my teammate, my confidant, and the person who's been by my side through all the chaos. For months, there was radio silence from my parents. No calls, no texts, nothing. Then, just before the holidays, I received a card in the mail. It was from them, but it was vague and impersonal, the kind of card you'd send to an acquaintance. It wished me a happy holiday season and mentioned that they hoped I was doing well, but there was no mention of Ethan or any acknowledgement of the past year. I decided to respond politely. I sent back a short message thanking them for the card and wishing them the same. I didn't try to reopen any doors or press for more communication. It was a small step, but I didn't want to chase them anymore. I had spent too long trying to gain their approval, and I was done putting myself in that position. Meanwhile, the support Ethan and I received from family friends and extended family only grew. We were invited to countless dinners, parties, and gatherings, and people made a point of including Ethan. It felt like the community around us had embraced us fully, making up for the gap left by my parents. Ethan, ever gracious, made an effort to connect with everyone, and people couldn't stop raving about him. Then, my sibling dropped an unexpected announcement. They were organizing a family reunion. They wanted to bring everyone together, including my parents, Ethan, and me. I wasn't sure how I felt about it at first. The idea of being in the same room as my parents again after everything was daunting, but my sibling assured me that they wanted this to be a chance for healing, not more conflict. Ethan and I decided to attend. When we arrived at the venue, a cozy rented hall filled with decorations and the smell of catered food, we were greeted warmly by everyone. My parents showed up shortly after. They were civil, exchanging polite nods with Ethan and me, but it was clear they were keeping their distance. They mingled with other guests but avoided coming near us. Throughout the event, I could see people noticing the tension. My parents would glance in our direction and then quickly look away. It didn't go unnoticed, and several people made a point of coming over to talk to Ethan and me, almost as if to show their support in a subtle way. Toward the end of the night, my siblings stood up to give a speech. They talked about family unity and the importance of coming together despite differences. It was a heartfelt message, but there was an underlying edge to it. Without naming names, they called out the need to let go of grudges and embrace the people who matter. The room went quiet, and I could feel my parents shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Not long after, my parents left. They didn't make a scene or say goodbye, they just quietly slipped out. It was disappointing, but not surprising. At this point, I had stopped expecting any breakthroughs from them. As the evening wound down, my sibling came over to thank Ethan and me for coming. They told us how proud they were of the way we'd handled everything, especially in the face of so much resistance. It was a small moment, but it meant a lot. Over the next few weeks, life returned to its new normal. My parents remained distant, but they stopped spreading rumors or interfering. They seemed to have accepted that Ethan and I were a permanent fixture, even if they couldn't bring themselves to embrace it. I've come to realize that their behavior has more to do with their own insecurities than anything else. They've always struggled with letting go of control, and this situation was no different. But I've also learned that their issues don't have to be mine. I can love them from a distance without letting their approval, or lack of it, define my life. Ethan has been my rock through it all, and seeing how he's handled everything with grace and patience has only made me love him more. One evening, as we sat together reflecting on the past year, he told me how proud he was of the way I'd stood up for myself and for us. Hearing that from him felt like the closure I needed. Today, I feel a sense of peace. My chosen family, the friends, relatives, and community that have rallied around us, has filled the void my parents left behind. I no longer feel the need to prove anything to anyone. My life is full of love, joy, and people who genuinely care about me and Ethan. My parents may never fully come around, but that's okay. I've learned to move forward without regret, focusing on the life Ethan and I are building together. And honestly, it feels pretty incredible.